The signal came in on a standard galactic broadcast frequency, the kind used for emergency warnings and system-wide announcements. Every ship within 100 light years received it. Every space station logged it automatically. Every inhabited world in the Conclave's vast network stored it in their planetary archives. The message was short, clinical, and absolute. Korath 9, a mid-sized rocky world on the outer edge of the Dren Expanse, had been officially classified as uninhabitable by the Galactic Conclave's Department of Planetary Assessment. The reason listed was simple: extreme subsurface thermal instability, magnetic field collapse, and a molten core exhibiting irregular tectonic surges. Beyond any recorded safety threshold, the Conclave had seen planets like this before. Worlds that looked promising from orbit, but hid catastrophe beneath their crust. They always marked them, filed the reports, and moved on. There were thousands of better worlds to settle. Nobody argued with the Department of Planetary Assessment. Their data was precise. Their conclusions were final. When they said a planet would kill you, they meant it. Nobody argued, except the humans. The colony ship Endurance Unbroken had been in transit for 11 months when the broadcast reached them. Commander Yara Osei read the signal twice, handed it to her chief geological engineer, a broad-shouldered man named Dax Marrow, and watched his face carefully. He read it once. Then he smiled. That smile made the Conclave's representative on board, a tall, four-armed Drenathi official named Savath Rel, deeply uncomfortable. He had been assigned to this mission as a formality, a diplomatic gesture to acknowledge the humans' first major colonization push into the expanse. He had expected the mission to be routine. He had expected the humans to behave like every other species that received a department classification, turn around, file a complaint if they wanted, and go somewhere safer. Savath Rel crossed two of his arms over his chest in the Drenathi posture of firm disapproval. "Commander Osei," he said carefully, "you understand what this classification means. The core of Korath 9 is not simply unstable. It is violent. The thermal readings suggest eruption cycles that would register as extinction-level events on the surface. The magnetic field is collapsing. The Conclave's instruments detected 17 separate tectonic fractures in the lower mantle alone. No species in recorded history has attempted to settle a Class 7 core world." Yara Osei looked at him with calm, dark eyes. "What class is Earth's core?" Savath Rel paused. He had reviewed Earth's geological data years ago when the Conclave first made contact with humanity. He remembered the numbers. "Class 6, he said slowly. "But your people evolved alongside that environment over millions of years. You did not choose it." "No," Yara agreed. "We didn't choose it. But we didn't leave it either. We dug into it. We built on top of it. We learned every frequency it shook at, every pressure point it cracked through, and we built cities anyway." She folded her hands on the table. "Korath 9 is Class 7. That's one step above home. We're not scared of one step." Savath Rel filed an official objection that evening. He sent it to the Conclave with a personal note attached, describing the conversation and warning his superiors that the humans appeared to have no intention of redirecting course. The response from Conclave Central took 6 hours to arrive. It read, "We understand. Please continue to monitor and report. Do not interfere unless absolutely necessary." There was a secondary note from a senior analyst that Savath Rel found less comforting than the official response. It said, "They landed on a planet with active megafauna, plate tectonics, hurricanes, and biological pathogens that targeted their own immune systems and decided to stay. Korath 9 is unlikely to discourage them. The Endurance Unbroken reached Korath 9 on a gray morning, at least. The orbital calculations told them it was morning on the hemisphere they approached. The planet didn't look deadly from above. It looked almost beautiful, broad rust-red plains broken by mountain ranges that glittered with mineral deposits, wide shallow seas the color of copper, and thick bands of cloud moving slowly across the upper atmosphere. The surface temperature was survivable. The air was breathable with filtration. From orbit, it looked like a place worth settling. Then the surface scanners updated. Dax. Merrill pulled the data onto the main screen and walked the crew through it, with the calm efficiency of a man who genuinely loved geological violence. The core was not simply hot. It was active in ways that defied comfortable description. Massive rivers of liquid iron churned beneath a lower mantle, fractured in 17 places, just as the conclave report said. But Dax had run his own numbers, overlaid them against the conclave's models, and found something the Department of Planetary Assessment had not bothered to look for, because no species had ever needed to look for it. The tectonic fractures weren't random. They followed a pattern, a pulse, a rhythm that repeated every 41 hours with an accuracy that bordered on mechanical. "It's not chaos," Dax said, highlighting the pattern with a broad sweep of his finger across the display. "It's a cycle. We can map it. We can time it. And if you can time something, you can work around it." Savathrel stared at the screen. "You are describing the planet's core as though it is a machine you intend to understand." "That's exactly what I'm doing," Dax said pleasantly. First landing team touched down at a site Dax had selected on the edge of the largest stable geological plate on the northern continent. It was stable in relative terms. The ground only shook twice during the 2-hour survey, and neither tremor exceeded a magnitude that any of the humans found alarming. Savathrel, who had never experienced a planetary tremor in his life, gripped a support strut both times and said nothing because he did not trust his voice. The survey team collected core samples. They deployed deep ground sensors that would feed data back to the ship in real time. They took atmospheric readings, magnetic field measurements, and soil composition analyses. Then Yara-Aze crouched down and pressed one gloved hand flat against the red dirt of Kurath 9, feeling the faint, deep vibration that ran through the ground like a slow heartbeat. The planet was alive beneath her palm, restless, powerful. She liked it immediately. Back on the ship, the team processed 3 days of sensor data before Dax presented his findings to the full Colonization Council. The news was exactly as dangerous as the conclave claimed, and exactly as workable as he had hoped. The 41-hour pulse cycle was confirmed. The 17 fractures were mapped. The thermal vents, which the conclave had logged simply as extreme hazards, were actually concentrated in 2 long belts running northeast to southwest across the main continent, and both belts ran directly above deposits of geothermal energy, so concentrated that Dax had to recalculate his instruments twice before he believed the readings. The conclave looked at this planet and saw a death trap, he said, standing before the council with his arms crossed and his data projected behind him in columns of glowing numbers. That's because they were looking at it like it was a place to survive. He paused. We should look at it like it's a place to use. The council voted. The result was not close. 3 weeks later, the first foundation anchors went into the ground. They were deep-bore titanium alloy shafts designed by a team of human engineers who had spent the transit voyage redesigning standard colonization templates for extreme geological environments. Each shaft was fitted with active dampening systems, technology originally developed for deep-sea drilling platforms on Earth that would absorb tectonic movement rather than resist it. The colonists didn't build against the planet. They built with it, the way a sailor doesn't fight the current, but reads it, rides it, and goes where they need to go. Savathrel watched the construction begin from the observation deck of the Endurance Unbroken. His 4 arms folded tightly, His expression caught somewhere between professional concern and something he was reluctant to name. He sent another report to the conclave. He described the Foundation anchors. He described geothermal survey. He described Commander Osei pressing her hand to the ground as though greeting the planet. He ended his report with a single line that his superiors would later quote in academic papers for the next 2 centuries. I do not think this planet is going to stop them. I am beginning to suspect that nothing will dot down on the surface. The ground shook again. The humans didn't flinch. They just adjusted their measurements and kept building. 6 months after the first Foundation anchors went into the ground, Korath 9 had a name. The colonists called it Ironhold, and the name spread through the conclave's communications network, not because any official body approved it, but simply because people kept using it. The Drenathi ambassador, who received Savathrel's reports, started using it in his summaries. A conclave historian mentioned it in a footnote. Within 8 months of the colony's founding, galactic databases had updated automatically, Korath 9, commonly referred to as Ironhold Human Colonial Settlement. Status, ongoing. The status field had been left deliberately vague because nobody at the conclave knew what word to use. Thriving felt premature. Surviving felt inaccurate. What the humans were doing on Ironhold did not map cleanly onto anything the conclave's Department of Colonial Affairs had seen before. The geothermal belt had been the first major breakthrough. Dax Marrow's team had spent 60 days mapping every thermal vent in the northern belt with ground-penetrating sensors, building a picture of the energy network that ran beneath the colony site the way an engineer maps a power grid before connecting it. The vents weren't random holes in the ground. They were pressure release points along fracture lines, and they followed the same 41-hour cycle as the tectonic pulse. When the pulse compressed the lower mantle, pressure built along the fractures and vented upward in predictable bursts. The conclave had called this an extreme hazard. Dax had called it a schedule. The first geothermal tap went online 47 days into the colony's construction phase. It was a brutally simple design, a reinforced shaft driven down to the vent channel, lined with heat exchange coils pulled from the Endurance Unbroken's engineering reserves, and connected to a surface generator array that the crew had originally planned to use as emergency backup power. The first time the pulse cycle activated and hot gas surged up the shaft, the generator array produced 3 times the power output the engineers had calculated as a best-case scenario. The second tap went in the next week, then a third. By the end of the 4th month, Ironhold was running entirely on geothermal power drawn from the planet's own violent core. And the surplus was large enough that Dax's team had begun talking about expansion. Savathrel filed his reports faithfully. The conclave read them with increasing attention. Other species began paying attention too, not because they wanted to settle Ironhold themselves, but because a human colony successfully extracting industrial-scale energy from a Class 7 core world was the kind of development that changed certain assumptions. That had been stable for a long time. The Velhari Collective, a civilization of slow-moving, methodical builders who had mastered orbital construction but never managed deep planet engineering, sent a formal inquiry to the conclave asking whether the humans had developed new technology or whether they had simply done something that everyone else had considered impossible and was apparently not. The conclave's official response was diplomatic and carefully worded. The unofficial answer that circulated among conclave analysts was shorter. They didn't develop new technology. They just weren't afraid of the data. On the surface of Ironhold, the colonists were too busy to pay attention to what the galaxy thought of them. The settlement had grown from the initial landing site into a cluster of 7 connected habitation zones, each one anchored with the deep-bore shafts that had become the signature of Ironhold construction. The buildings themselves were low and wide, built to distribute weight and flex with ground movement rather than standing rigid against it. Every structure had active dampening built into its foundation, the same system as the anchor shafts, scaled up, constantly reading the ground beneath and making micro-adjustments in real time. The colonists had started calling the buildings floaters because they didn't sit on the ground so much as rest on a cushion of managed force. Always slightly in motion, always compensating. The Conclave's Department of Planetary Assessment sent a review team on the 8th month. 3 senior assessors arrived on a Conclave shuttle, reviewed their own original data on the approach, and then landed on a planet that their instruments still classified as Class 7 fatal, and walked into a settlement of 4,000 people going about their lives with the calm efficiency of a population that had long since decided that danger was a problem to be solved, not a reason to leave. The lead assessor, a Drenathi named Ovith Say, who had written part of the original classification report, asked to speak with Commander Assay. She met him in the colony's Central Operations Building, a broad, low structure with walls that absorbed vibration and floors that moved, just slightly, a movement so gentle that most humans stopped noticing it after a week. But that made Ovith Say grip the edge of the table for the entire meeting. He asked her, with the careful professional courtesy of someone trying not to sound as baffled as he actually was, how the colonists had managed the tectonic cycle without losing structures in the early weeks when the mapping was still incomplete. Yara Osei thought about the question for a moment, then answered honestly. "We lost 4 structures," she said, "in the first 6 weeks. 2 prefab storage units and 2 early-phase habitation modules. No casualties. We'd pulled everyone back before the pulse cycle on schedule. We assessed the damage, figured out why those specific anchor placements failed, redesigned, and rebuilt." She looked at him steadily. "We lose things sometimes. Then we fix the reason we lost them." Ovith Say stared at her. He had spent his career classifying dangerous worlds and steering civilizations away from them. The concept of losing 4 structures, analyzing the failure, and treating it as a data point rather than a catastrophe was not something he had a professional framework for. He wrote it down carefully in his assessment notes. He wasn't sure what category to file it under. The review team spent 10 days on Ironhold. In that time, the planet shook 43 times by their instruments count. The colonists registered 11 of those as significant enough to check their monitoring systems. None required evacuation. None caused structural damage. By the 5th day, Ovith Say had stopped gripping the table during tremors. He was starting to understand why, not because the planet had become less violent, but because the humans had mapped its violence so precisely that the shaking had become information rather than threat. What he had not expected, and what formed the most significant section of his revised assessment, was the construction project that Dax Marrow had begun in the colony's 3rd month, and had not mentioned in any official communication to the Conclave, because, as Dax explained when the review team found it, he hadn't thought it was anyone else's business yet. The deep bore shaft network that powered the colony had been quietly extended. The original geothermal taps were still running, still feeding the surface generators. But a secondary network of shafts had been driven deeper, far deeper than anything needed for power generation, into the upper mantle itself. These shafts were not taps. They were sensors. Thousands of precision instruments embedded at multiple depths, feeding a continuous stream of data to a processing system in the colony's operations center that was building, in real time, the most detailed picture of a planetary interior that had ever been assembled. Dax's team wasn't just living on the planet. They were reading it, learning its interior, the way a doctor learns a patient. Every pressure point, every temperature fluctuation, every subtle shift in the magnetic field that preceded a larger tectonic event. "You are mapping the core," Ovithse said. Standing in the operations center in front of a display that showed Ironhull's interior as a luminous three-dimensional model, alive with color-coded data streams. "We're mapping everything," Dax said. He zoomed the display out to show the full mantle layer, then the core boundary, then the iron inner core itself, a sphere of dense, pressurized metal rotating slightly faster than the planet above it, generating the magnetic field that the conclave had classified as collapsing. "The magnetic field isn't collapsing," Dax continued. "It's shifting. There's a difference. The inner core's rotation is decoupling from the mantle. The two layers are moving at different speeds, which disrupts the field temporarily. But it's cyclical. Like everything else on this planet, it has a pattern. The field will restabilize in approximately 19 years. He glanced at the assessor. "We'll be fine." Ovithse sent his revised assessment to the conclave 2 days later. It was significantly longer than the original classification report, and it came with a recommendation that no other species had ever prompted from the Department of Planetary Assessment before. It read, "The Class 7 designation remains technically accurate by all standard measurement criteria. However, I recommend the conclave develop a secondary classification system for environments of this type, worlds that are dangerous by conventional standards, but have been demonstrated to be manageable by human colonization methodology. The existing system has no framework for a settlement that is not merely surviving a CLAS's 7 environment, but actively using it. I further recommend that the conclave request access to the interior, mapping data being compiled on Karth 9. Whatever the humans are building in that planet, the rest of the galaxy should be paying close attention." The conclave took 3 weeks to formally respond. In TH, the Kreth VOR arrived without warning on a cold Ironhold morning, 17 months after the colony's founding. There were 4 ships, heavy cruiser class by the conclave's recognition profiles, each one bristling with weapons arrays that the colony's passive scanners identified and logged with quiet, methodical accuracy before anyone on the surface had finished their morning meal. The Kreth VOR were not members of the Galactic Conclave. They were not members of anything by choice. They were an old species expansionist, and they had developed an efficient system over several centuries. They located resource-rich worlds that other civilizations were in the process of settling, waited until the infrastructure was established and the hard exploratory work was done, and then they came and took it. They had done this 11 times. The strategy worked because new colonies were always vulnerable, cut off from their home systems. Still building, not yet defended, the Kreth VOR commander, A being called Droth Coven, broadcast a standard acquisition message on open frequencies. The message was identical to the one his fleet had sent to every previous colony they had seized. It outlined, in precise and businesslike terms, that the colony's assets were being claimed under Kreth VOR territorial law, that the colonists had 48 hours to evacuate to their ship, and that any resistance would be met with orbital bombardment. It was not a threat made in anger. It was a policy statement, delivered with the calm efficiency of an organization that had never had the policy-challenged .dr/ADHE. Coven waited for the response with the patience of someone who had done this before and knew how it went. The colonists would panic. They would send distress calls to their home system, calls that would take months to receive a response. They would argue among themselves. A few would want to fight. Most would want to live. The ones who wanted to live would win the argument, because the ones who wanted to fight would look at 4 heavy cruisers in orbit and understand that the math did not work in their favor. This was always how it went. Commander Yara Osei received the acquisition message in the operations center. She read it twice, as was her habit with documents that required a careful response. Then she called a meeting. Not an emergency council session, a regular meeting, the kind that started on time and ran according to agenda. The colonists who attended later described her demeanor as focused. One described it as the same face she made when reviewing engineering reports that had an interesting problem in them. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Yara sent a response to Drathkoven's fleet. The message was short. It acknowledged receipt of the acquisition notice, requested clarification on several points of Krethvor territorial law for the record, and informed the fleet commander that Ironhold's colonial administration would require 48 hours to consider its position. It was, on its surface, exactly the kind of response a frightened colony sent when it was stalling for time. Drat Koven granted the 48 hours. He was generous with time when the outcome was certain. What happened in those 48 hours was not visible from orbit. The Krethvor fleet's sensors were good, military grade, calibrated for detecting weapons buildup, troop movement, ship launches. They detected none of those things. What they could not detect, because no Krethvor sensor array had ever been calibrated to look for it, was what Dax Marrow was doing 6 kilometers underground. The deep-bore shaft network had been built for 2 purposes, though only one had been officially discussed. The first purpose, geothermal power extraction and planetary interior mapping, was in every report sent to the conclave. The second purpose was in Dax Marrow's notebook, in the sketches he had made 17 months ago, after looking at his model of the planet's core and thinking about what you could do with a volatile, cycling, mapped geothermal system if you needed it to do something other than generate electricity. The tectonic pulse cycle ran every 41 hours with mechanical precision. Dax's team had spent 17 months not just reading that cycle, but understanding its mechanics at a level of detail that let them do something no one had designed those shafts to do. They could push back. Not much, not globally, but at specific fracture points, with precisely timed pressure releases through the geothermal tap shafts, they could influence when and where the cycle expressed itself on the surface. They couldn't stop the planet from shaking, but they could, with 17 months of data and a team of engineers who had thought about nothing else, choose where it shook hardest. The Krethvor fleet was in a standard low orbit, close enough for effective bombardment, far enough to avoid atmospheric drag. Drathkoven was reviewing the colony's asset inventory, which his long-range scanners had partially mapped, when the first seismic event registered on his ship's sensors. He noted it without concern. The Conclave's classification of Kurth 9 was in his mission briefing. He had known the planet had an active core. That was irrelevant to orbital operations. The second event registered 6 hours later, larger. His sensor officer flagged it. Drathkoven reviewed the data and maintained his assessment. Geological instability, irrelevant to orbital operations. The third event was different. It was not larger than the second. It was targeted. The seismic wave it generated propagated outward from a specific point on the northern continent, traveled through the crust and into the upper mantle, and then did something that Drathkoven's sensor officer spent 4 minutes staring at before she reported it, because she needed to confirm she was reading the instruments correctly. The wave hit the planet's magnetic field disruption zone, the area that the Conclave had classified as a collapsing magnetic field at the precise moment when a natural pulse cycle was venting through the northern belt, and the combination produced a magnetic field surge that lasted 11 seconds and blanked every electronic system within the surge. Radius. The surge radius included low orbit, 4 heavy. Cruisers lost navigation, targeting, and communications simultaneously for 11 seconds. Backup systems engaged. Primary systems came back online. No permanent damage. But in those 11 seconds, 3 things happened that Drathkovan would spend a long time thinking about afterward. First, his fleet's weapons arrays had lost targeting lock and taken 40 seconds to reacquire. And during that 40 seconds, something had moved on the surface. Second, when communications restored, there was a new message from the colony's administration waiting in his queue. Third, his sensor officer reported that the seismic event had been artificially triggered. The resonance patterns didn't match natural tectonic activity. Something underground had caused it deliberately. The message from Commander Asay was longer than her first response. It was also, Drathkovan recognized slowly, not a message from a frightened colony. It was a technical briefing. It described, in precise engineering language, the geothermal tap network, the tectonic pulse mapping system, the magnetic field interaction data that Dax Marrow's team had spent 17 months collecting, and the specific mechanism by which the colony could generate targeted seismic events at will. It described the 11-second blackout his fleet had just experienced as a demonstration. It noted that a sustained version of the same event, triggered at 4-hour intervals timed to the natural pulse cycle, would produce recurring blackout windows that would make maintaining a stable orbital position, let alone a targeting solution, effectively impossible. Then it described something else, deeper in the shaft network, in the sections that had never been mentioned in any official report. Dax's team had identified 3 lower mantle fracture points, where the tectonic pressure had been building for 2 cycles without a natural vent event. They were overloaded, geological batteries holding more energy than the cycle could release naturally. With the right pressure injection through the shaft network, those 3 fractures could be triggered simultaneously. The energy release would not be survivable at the surface of the affected zone. From orbit, the event would register as a planetary-scale tectonic eruption. The affected zone was directly below the colony's location. Commander Osei's message was clear on this point. She was not threatening to destroy the colony. She was informing Drathkovan that the planet itself could do it, that her people understood exactly how and when, and that a species willing to build a colony on a Class 7 core world and spend 17 months learning to play it like an instrument was a species that had already made its peace with the question of how far they were willing to go. DRA to Kovan sat in his command chair for a long time. He reviewed the technical data his own sensors had captured from the demonstration event. He ran probability calculations on the colony's claimed capabilities. He thought about 11 previous colonies that had not had 17 months to prepare, and had not had a Class 7 planet beneath their feet, and had not looked at the acquisition notice with a face that, according to his communications officer, who had received the visual component of the response, looked more interested than afraid. He sent a response at hour 31 of the 48-hour window. It acknowledged the colony's technical briefing. It withdrew the acquisition notice. It requested, with a formality that would have been amusing in any other context, that Ironhold's administration share its geothermal mapping methodology with KR. The news of what happened at Ironhold reached the Galactic Conclave 3 weeks after Drathkovan's fleet left orbit. It reached them through 4 separate channels simultaneously: Savathrel's ongoing reports, the Department of Planetary Assessment's revised field notes, an intercepted Krethvor internal communication that a Conclave intelligence operative had flagged for immediate escalation, and a brief factual message from Commander Yara Osei that described the incident, listed the technical systems involved, and ended with a request for official recognition of Ironhold as a sovereign human territorial holding under Conclave law. The message had no emotional language in it. It did not boast. It did not threaten. It read like a progress report, which was, Conclave analysts agreed privately, somehow more unsettling than if it had been a declaration of triumph. The Conclave convened a special session to discuss Ironhold. Representatives of 41 species attended. The discussion lasted 9 hours. The Dranathi delegation, which had the most direct experience with human behavior through Sava-Threll's field reports, spent most of those 9 hours answering questions from delegations that were encountering the Ironhold data for the first time and were struggling to place it into a framework that made sense. The Velhari collective senior delegate asked the question that most of the room was thinking but hadn't said directly. The colony used the planet's own geological systems as a weapon. They learned to trigger tectonic events on a schedule. How long would it take them to scale this? How much of the planet can they control? The Dranathi ambassador looked at his notes, then looked at the room. Based on the rate at which they have expanded their deep-bore network in the past 17 months, he said, and assuming consistent progress, the colony's engineering team estimates full mantle coverage within 4 years. Core boundary access within 9. He paused. At that point, they will have more complete operational knowledge of a planetary interior than any species has ever possessed. What they choose to do with that knowledge is not something we can predict, because no one has ever been in that position before. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the Velhari delegate asked a follow-up question. And the planet? Kurath 9, Ironhold, is still Class 7? Still exhibiting the same geological violence the original assessment documented? Yes, the Dranathi ambassador said. Completely unchanged. The planet is exactly as dangerous as the original classification indicated. He let the pause sit for a second. The humans built a fortress in it anyway. On Ironhold, the population had passed 12,000. The 7 habitation zones had expanded and connected, and new residential sectors were under construction on the eastern plateau, where the geological profile was slightly less active. Slightly? In Ironhold terms, meaning that the ground shook an average of twice a day rather than 4 times. Children born on Ironhold had never known a planet that didn't move beneath them. They grew up with tremor drills, the way other children grew up with fire drills. And most of them found the concept of a geologically still planet vaguely unpleasant when it was described to them. The way you might find a room with no air circulation, technically survivable, but missing something important. Dax. Marrow had handed day-to-day management of the geothermal network to a team of 12 engineers he had trained over the past year and a half. He was spending most of his time underground, not at the shaft network, deeper. A new project had been running for 6 months. Classified not because anyone had made an official decision to classify it, but because Dax had a habit of not telling people things until he had something to show them. And he didn't have something to show them yet. The project was called, in Dax's notebook, simply Phase 2. Phase 1 had been the mapping, learning every layer of the planet from crust to core boundary, reading its rhythms, understanding its mechanics well enough to interact with them deliberately. Phase 2 was something different. Phase 2 was the question Dax had been sitting with since the Kreth VO left orbit, when he had stood in the operations center looking at his planet model and thought, we used this planet as a shield. What if we designed it to be one? The inner core of Ironhold was a sphere of solid iron roughly 2,000 kilometers across, rotating slightly faster than the planet's mantle, generating a magnetic field that the conclave had, classified as collapsing, and Dax had correctly identified as shifting. The decoupling between the core's rotation and the mantle's rotation was the source of the magnetic field. Disruption, the 11-second blackout windows, that had ended the Kreth VR's interest in the colony. It was a natural effect, unpredictable in timing, which was why the colony had spent months mapping it. Phase 2 was the question of whether it had to stay unpredictable. The inner core's rotation rate was not fixed. It varied slightly based on pressure interactions with the mantle, on temperature gradients, on the same pulse cycle that drove everything else in the planet's interior. Dax's sensors had 17 months of rotation rate data. His models could predict the variation within a small margin of error. And if you could predict the variation, you could, in theory, influence it, not the core itself, which was far too deep and too massive for any technology humans currently possess to touch directly. But the pressure interactions at the core mantle boundary that drove the variation dot, it was an engineering problem. A very large, very difficult, very deep engineering problem that would require sensors and equipment that didn't exist yet, and that would have to be built in an environment of extreme heat and pressure using materials that had to be designed specifically for conditions that no laboratory on Earth or Ironhold had tested. It was the kind of problem that would take a decade of work, even if everything went right. Dax had started anyway, because in his experience, the fact that something would take a long time was not a reason not to start. The Conclave formally recognized Ironhold as a sovereign human, territorial holding 8 months after Commander Osei's request. The vote was not unanimous. The Kreth VOR had no standing in the Conclave, but several Conclave member species who had benefited from Kreth VOR trade relationships abstained, but it passed with a substantial majority. Savothrel, who had been officially reassigned from his monitoring role, but had requested to remain on Ironhold as an independent diplomatic observer, attended the small ceremony the colonists held to mark the recognition. He stood at the edge of the gathering and watched Commander Osei receive the formal communication from the Conclave. And he thought about the moment 11 months ago when she had pressed her hand to the planet's surface as though greeting it. He understood that gesture differently now. It wasn't affection, exactly. It wasn't the romantic connection to land that some species developed for their homeworlds. It was something more practical than that. It was the same gesture a pilot made running their hands over an unfamiliar aircraft before a first flight, reading the machine, feeling for what it could do, deciding whether you trusted it. Yara Osei had pressed her hand to the ground of Ironhold and felt a planet that could kill her in 41-hour cycles. That shook constantly, that hid in its core enough energy to rearrange continents. And she had made the same assessment she made about everything. This is a problem that can be understood. And once understood, used. 2 years after the Kreth VOR incident, a Conclave military analysis team published a classified report on Ironhold's defensive profile. The report went to the senior military councils of every Conclave member species. Its conclusions were careful, thoroughly sourced, and deeply uncomfortable reading for anyone in the business of projecting military force. The colony was not fortified in any conventional sense. There were no orbital weapons platforms, no planetary shield arrays, no surface-to-space missile systems. The colonists had no fleet of their own. By every standard metric, the settlement was militarily UNDEFENDED. The report's conclusion occupied 3 pages. It explained that standard metrics did not apply. A colony that could trigger targeted seismic events, generate electromagnetic pulse windows on a cycle, and had 17-month-old plans for expanding that capability to full mantle scale, was not an undefended settlement. It was a weapon system that happened to have people living inside it. Attacking Ironhold with conventional military force would be analogous to attacking a bomb by poking it. Technically possible, practically inadvisable. The report recommended that all Conclave military planning assume Ironhold as an impenetrable position until human engineering capabilities were better understood, and noted that attempting to better understand human engineering capabilities would itself require the cooperation of the humans, who had been politely but consistently disinclined to share technical details with anyone who hadn't demonstrated a reason to trust them. On the day the report was distributed, Dax Marrow was 6 kilometers underground, reviewing core mantle boundary pressure data with a junior engineer who had grown up on Ironhold and thought planetary. Interiors were the most interesting thing in the universe. The junior engineer, a young woman named Syrah, born in the colony's second month, asked Dax what he thought they would find when the deep sensors finally reached the core boundary layer. Still 2 years, and a lot of engineering away. Dax looked at his readings for a moment. The plan,